want to tell you a little bit about my life experience so you understand why I believe that God is a keeper of His Word. Yes. Okay? In the beginning, I didn't really believe that. I didn't really experience it. Okay? So I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist, baptized in one of the Pennsylvania churches here in Philadelphia area, Chestnut Hill. That was because my church in Hatboro, now called Bucks County, didn't have a baptistry way back then. So I had to go to Chestnut Hill to be baptized, and I was probably between 9 and 11, somewhere in there. Wanted to be baptized, wanted to serve my Lord. And I can remember my father driving me home that day after the baptism, and my hair was damp, you know how it is after you've been baptized by immersion. And it was kind of cool fall day, and the window by my head got all steamy. And I can remember as if it was yesterday. I looked up through that steam, and I said, "Oh God, from this day forward," just a youngster I am, just this day forward, I will never sin again. Now, I meant it, but I didn't know what you know. I was doing the exact same thing the children of Israel did when, they heard the law proclaimed. They said, all that the Lord has said, we will do it in our own strength and power. Oh, is that a painful way to go? Okay, but God doesn't give up on us. He knows our hearts. He knows what we want. And that's where the next story comes in. I was attending one of the churches in the Allentown area. I can't remember if it was Allentown or if it was Bethlehem. But you know the difference between preaching and meddling? Yeah? Well, I heard a preacher that I thought got into serious meddling. I was in the congregation there, and he said, talking about planned giving, back in the days in the 70s, it was much more common. You don't hear too much about stewardship today in our churches. And that's a shame. But anyway, he said, you ought to pay tithe on your gross income. You said, what? I was going, no, because I knew it wouldn't work. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You've heard of the Great Controversy, right? It's a book, but it's more than a book. The Great Controversy is the war that goes on between good and evil, between my two fingers, and your two fingers if you put them up to your temple areas. It's a war. Good and evil's fighting for the mastery. Who will you serve? Who will you love? Who will you believe? So, at this point, I was sure I was right, because back in the 1970s when this happened, late 70s, early 80s, I was very familiar with taxation, okay, and countries' tax rates, their upper tax bracket. Does anybody know what the upper tax bracket is in England, or was in England anyway? Higher than ours? Do you know how high it was? 90%. Wow, now you know why a lot of the sports stars, the rock and roll musicians, as soon as they got to making a lot of money, they came to another country, America, or perhaps one of the other countries in Europe, so that they didn't have to pay that high tax rate. So I was a little steamed when I heard the pastor get into meddling, in my opinion. Okay, so at least I did the right thing. I went to God in prayer. Now, God's big enough to be able to hear your side of the story, even if it's wrong. Even if it's wrong. So I said in prayer, I said, Lord, he's saying that this should be tithe on the gross. In other words, before I pay my federal tax, my state income tax, my local tax, my township tax, did I get enough taxes yet? Social Security tax. So many taxes, okay. You should pay it on the gross. I said, Lord, I know this doesn't work. because I know the tax rate in England is 90%. Now, if I make $1 million a year, I don't, but if I did back then, let's say I made $1 million, what would my federal or my government tax bill be? 90% of $1 million is how much? 900,000. So I said, and Lord, I know that the tithe is 10%. So 10% of $1 million is 100,000, right? Now, if you add $900,000 to the government, $100,000 to the church, that leaves me how much to live on? A big zero. So I said, Lord, it doesn't work. Now, God is so patient. Sometimes it pays to be quiet, to be still, he says, and know that I am God. I wasn't still for very long, but immediately a thought came into my mind when I was in prayer. It says, Al, where do you live? And the answer was so fast I couldn't even think about it. Well, I live in the United States. I don't live in England, do I? My whole scenario out the window. So I made a commitment to God. I said, all right, Lord, from this day forward, I will start paying tithe on the gross before the taxes and all those other deductions come out. I said, I'll do it until I go bankrupt. I'm being honest with you. That was you've heard that text in the Bible, O ye of little faith? My Bible says now, O Al of little faith, because that's where I was at that time. Well, first month went by and I didn't go bankrupt, the second month and whatnot, and I'm thinking, after a year it was time to do taxes. I hadn't been keeping score, but do you want to know what God did to our income in 1 year? Anybody want to guess? He multiplied it by how much? By 2? Did I hear somebody say 2? Do you live in my house? He doubled our income. And I just looked up and said, how do you do this? And then I started reading, like our scripture text, the prescription for prosperity. Believe, the 2 Chronicles 20 and verse 20. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Roots under you. You'll have a home or whatever there. Then it says, believe his prophets, and you shall what? Prosper. What's prosper mean? You start to be rewarded in a financial way, or perhaps in another way, health-wise, or perhaps a different way, whichever way God chooses to prosper you. Now, I'm not suggesting this, that you would say, well, I'm going to start doing all this so that God will make me rich. But if you go into it with the attitude, I will do this because it's what the Lord wants me to do, and he only wants me to do what's best for me, then stand back and watch, because he is an amazing God. You cannot outgive him. And he will never, David says, he's never seen the children of the righteous begging for bread. So, you figure it all out, and now you'll understand why I believe in God's promises and why I believe his servant, Ellen White. You've heard of Ellen White in this church or no? Okay. Hopefully, most of you, if you have read her writings, will say, I believe in her, that she was an inspired prophet. Now, if you don't yet, continue to read and study and pray. But the book that turned me around was The Desire of Ages. You can't read that book without getting closer to God. That's what I found. That's what I found. And just so you know, I had to practice a real fast story now. I don't want to keep you from important things like lunch. So this will remind me. I was in Stroudsburg and I had an arrangement with God. I said, Lord, I want to witness to those that, come into my office, but please help me. I said, here's the arrangement. I'll ask them, what's your problem visually? Well, most people would say, well, I can't see distance, I can't read the signs, or I can't read too good. And I said, well, if they say that they can't read really good, or they're having blurred vision, I'm going to ask them, what kind of reading do they enjoy doing? And if they say spiritual, then that's my clue. Then I will take the time, and I used to give out Desire of Ages paperbacks by the cartons. So I gave it to this one gentleman, and I said, I think this will be a benefit to you in your scriptural studies. I said, I found it a real blessing to me. A few weeks later, I was eating lunch, and my office manager says, Dr. Navarro, so-and-so's out there, and he wants to talk to you. I said, but I'm eating lunch. No, I think you're going to want to talk to him now because he wants another copy of the Desire of Ages. I said, oh, lunch? Forget that. This is important work. So I went out and I said, oh, so you lost the book, huh? He says, no. I said, I want another copy. I said, well, why do you need another copy? He said, to keep peace in my family. Keep peace in the family? He says, yes, every time I'm reading it, my wife's angry because she wants to read the book. And every time she's reading it, I want it, so I want to buy another copy. I said, no, you can't buy it, I'll give it to you. No, I want to buy it. No. So I gave him another paperback copy. I didn't tell you that he was a PhD teaching at East Stroudsburg University, and he was in the English department. So he knows something about good writing, right? He comes back in a few months later and says, Dr. Navarro, I have a favor to ask of you. Would you be able to introduce me to E.G. White? That's what it said on the Desire of Ages, E.G. White. And I realized he was serious. I wanted to snicker, but I couldn't. I said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't. I said, she's passed away. He goes, oh, no, really? I said, yes, really. She's passed away. When? I told him in 1900s, early 1900s, 1915 or somewhere around there, 18. And he says, I can't believe that. He says, her writings are so fresh and so vibrant and alive. They draw me closer to Christ. And his wife as well. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, some of our own members may not even appreciate those red books. Not the way this couple was. So I shared with them, I said, well, that book is only one of a set of total of 5, the Conflict of the Ages series. He says, I want them, all of them. I says, all right, I'll get them. No, I'm paying for these. I said, no. So I said, all right, we'll compromise. You pay the cost of them. I didn't want him to have to pay more. So here, 2 individuals, PhDs in the same department in English and literature, and they loved it. They loved it. So I look at it and say, this is a gift of God to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Amen. Now, what I'm going to read to you, and I won't bore you to death with a lot of reading, but I want to share with you some of the Spirit of Prophecy quotes that deal with this very topic. Wills, trusts, stewardship. It's an interesting topic, but it might step on a few toes. So if you get angry, like I did when I heard the meddling, be prepared to have a little chat with God. Okay, and He can direct you. He can lead you. Listen to this first statement. It comes from one of those first 5 books that professor had to have and read. It's from Patriarchs and Prophets. It says this, page 753. You don't have to write down the whole quote. If you want to write down the page, you can. We will have tomorrow handouts of these quotes. Okay, so if you want, you can look them up and make sure that I quoted them right. All that man receives of God's bounty still belongs to God. Now that's an amazing statement. It all belongs to Him. Does He ask for it all back? He says only what? Wow. It's all His. He's giving it to me, and He only wants 10. Okay, but it still belongs to God. I want you to remember that part, okay? Why? Why does he require this? Listen to this. Whatever God has bestowed in the valuable and beautiful things of earth is placed in the hands of men and women to test them. Oh, so this is a test. Then I better be prepared. I want to pass this test. I don't want to fail it. Do you? No. It's an important one. It's a test to sound the depths of our love for him and our appreciation of his favors and the fact that he gave all of heaven to redeem us. They're my words of it. That's part of what I have to be thankful for. What a gift. What a God. Now this one is where it gets interesting. This is from the testimonies. Ellen White wrote 9 testimonies to the church. And this one comes from the 4th testimony, page 391, the first paragraph. Many, she says. How many? Many are going directly contrary to the light which God has given to his people. Who's his people? Uh-oh. So she's saying many of us are going directly contrary to the light that God has given. Why? Here's the answer. It's because they do not read the books which contain the light and knowledge in cautions, reproofs, and warnings. Oh my. And I won't tell you how old I was, and I was an elder in the church in Bucks County, and I had never read any of the testimonies. I had barely cracked some of the books in the Conflict of the Ages series. Okay? So, we know now that we don't read as much as we should. Perhaps, I won't get into meddling, but maybe it's because I spend too much time on my smartphone. Check the news, check this, check. But the good news is you can get an app that has Ellen White's writings all there for you. So when you have some spare time, you can look at the good things. So, first testimonies now, another testimonies, page 199, second paragraph. This one ought to get close to home and scare you, because it scares me. It says, I was shown the awful fact that Satan and his angels, who? Satan and his angels have had more to do with the management of the property of God's professed people than the Lord does. Ouch. Now, why would you make a statement like that? Because it's true? Well, let's see what she says we're doing that, is giving the devil free rein, and God doesn't have much to say about it. Because you realize whatever God says, he never forces you to do it, does he? No. He gave you a brain to think and decide whether you'll do what he says. It's a test. Or whether you say, it's all my money. Okay, so let's take a look and see what system she's talking about. This one comes from 4th Testimonies, page 482, in the 4th paragraph. Now she's going to get real close to home. Let it ever be kept in mind that the present selfish system of disposing of property is not God's plan, but man's device. Christians should be reformers and break up the present system, giving an entirely new aspect to the formation of wills, your last will and testament. Let the idea be ever present that it's the Lord's property which you are handling. And she says the will of God in this matter is law. But it's a test, folks. Will you or won't you? You get to make the decision. All right. Let's take a look at this one where we get closer to home and see how our wills can be getting us into some problem areas. This is from the third testimonies, and it's page 121, third paragraph. Fathers, she says, now she could also put mothers, because it could be father or mother or both. Fathers who selfishly retain their means, fancy language for money, to enrich their children, and who do not see the wants or needs of God's cause and relieve them, make a terrible mistake. Not a little one, she says, a terrible mistake. Now listen to this next sentence from the same place. The children whom they think to bless with their means are what? Who said cursed? This man's been doing some reading. They're cursed with it. I don't want to curse my son. Now, there's some good news coming. There's some more of the story. Okay? Is it ever wrong to give to children? No, there's some exceptions to this. Okay, and I'm going to share some of those with you so you don't go out of here going, well, that's it. I got to give everything to the church and that's all I can do. Too bad, family. No. That's not what is being said here. Listen to this. This is from the third testimonies, page 118, third and fourth paragraphs. 118, third and fourth paragraph. Parents should have great fear. How much fear? Great fear in entrusting children with the talents of monies that God has placed into their hands. We're talking the parents' hands. Now here's the qualifying word. Unless these qualifiers are met. So here comes the qualifiers. Are you ready? Unless they have the surest evidence that their children have a greater interest in, a greater love for, a greater devotion to the cause of God than they themselves, the parents, have. Wow. So it gives you some liberty there, but yet you got to be sure that the children are better spiritual condition than what you are. Now, are there some common sense things here that we need to consider? We need to realize that there are situations in families that require taking care of children even when they get into advancing years. Let me share this one with you. This is from Third Testimony 121, first paragraph. Parents should exercise the right that God has given them. He entrusted them the talents that He would have them use for His glory. The children were not to become responsible for the talents of the father. While they have sound minds and good judgment, parents should, with prayerful consideration and with the help of proper counselors who have experience in the truth and knowledge of the divine will, make disposition of their property. If, here comes the exceptions, ready? If they have children who are afflicted, what's an affliction? Illness. Like an illness, okay, they're afflicted. Or, another exception, struggling in poverty. So you hear the exceptions. And, this goes with those exceptions, and who will make a judicious use of those funds, those children should be considered. Isn't that a loving God who says that if they're struggling in poverty, they have an affliction, you take care of them, parents? Now you're young parents and you have just little kids. In your will, do you leave everything to God's work? Not in my opinion. This is my opinion. I can't prove it from Spirit of Prophecy, but if He says take care of the afflicted ones that are, maybe they have a physical ailment, they can't work, mentally maybe not competent, take care of them. What does God feel about those beautiful little assets that he's given to us in the form of little children? You have to take care of them. But remember, your will can be changed during your life. You can change it anytime you want. When those kids get older, they're through school, you've got them educated, they're now working. Now the funds that you have left, no demands from the family. Now we have to start thinking, maybe I have to change my will and go along with some of this counsel that God has given us. Hopefully all of it. I'm going to turn over the remaining time because I've shortchanged Bonnie in the last couple of places that I've been, and I don't want to do that anymore because I may not ever eat again. So Bonnie has some comments about wills and the law. Now, an attorney should know something about the law, okay? And it has to do with what Ellen White says about wills and the law. So please, give her your attention and see what she's got to say, and then she has a few stories that she wants to tell you as well. Thank you.
I've trained him well. Good morning, church. The quote that Al was referring to can be found in Adventist Home. It's on page 397. It says, "Wills should be made in a manner to stand the test of law." Now, most people, when they hear law, hear the word lawyer. And somebody told me there's a lot of people that just don't like lawyers. I don't get it. But apparently they're out there. And let me ask a question. How many people do we have here this morning that are DIYers, do-it-yourselfers? Yay. How's that working for you? Do all of the projects you undertake as a DIYer turn out the way you expect it? And I see hands going, eh. Sometimes they turn out not exactly the way you wanted them to turn out. Well, back in the early 1900s, we're told that many wills were written without regard to the requirements of the law. In fact, Ellen White says not 1 in 10 documents that were written as a do-it-yourself project stood the test of law, which meant 90% didn't pass the test of law, which meant that where the individual who drafted that will wanted their funds to go, including the support of the church, it didn't get there. It didn't stand the test of law. They wrote them in good faith, but when it was time for the assets to be distributed according to the document, it didn't work because they were not in compliance with the legal requirements. So what do we need to do in Pennsylvania to have a valid will? Have to be at least 18 years old, of sound mind, which means you know who you are, what you own, and where you want it to go. You have to put it in writing, and that doesn't necessarily mean handwriting, it can mean computer writing, typing. No oral wills are allowed anymore in Pennsylvania, and the document has to be signed at the end in front of 2 witnesses. That's the minimum legal requirement to create a will in Pennsylvania. So this morning Al started off talking about God's plan, and we recognize that we're stewards and he's the master. He lends it to us, but we manage it, and we're accountable for what we do with it. And he started to speak a little bit about children and some of the counsel that can be found as to what we need to do to provide for our children. And may I submit to you, one of the first things we need to provide for our children is a Christian home that models God's love. Amen. Then we need to provide them with an example of a good work ethic. We need to teach them that it's honest to labor for a paycheck, and teach them skills that will allow them to care for themselves as they mature. We also need to provide for our children an opportunity for a good education, so they'll be able to provide for themselves in the future as well as for the society in which they live. 3 Testimonies 1:22 tells us, "It is better to assist your children to help themselves, much better than to leave them a large amount of money at your death. Children who are left to rely principally on their own exertions make better men and women and are better fitted for a practical life than those children who have depended upon their father's estate. So parents, our job is to provide a foundation for our children, both spiritually and with skills they can use to provide for themselves and as they serve the Lord. Let me tell you a quick story about one of my clients. I was in practice in Pennsylvania for a number of years before we left to go to the West Coast. I had a client come in. She had 3 children, one of whom was mentally challenged. She had a will in place, but she had just recently discovered that her mentally challenged child was more severely afflicted than was first thought, and he was going to need more in-depth and longer care. So she wanted to make sure she had the right provisions set up in her documents to take care of that. She was also a very faithful member of her church, not an Adventist, but a very faithful, active, supportive member of her church. She made many visits to my office, going through draft after draft after draft after draft. She had the big picture, but she got hung up in some of the little minutia, little tiny things, and she just couldn't work out some of those little tiny things, but I don't know, it was after probably the 112th visit. It was a long time. We finally got it into a form where she was ready to sign it. A couple days later, I was at home, and I don't usually have the TV on when I'm getting dressed for work, but that morning I did, and there was a news flash that came across the TV. And you know how they break it into little sound bites, that there's a police incident here, and it's in this town, and it's on this street. And the more they gave out information, it kept getting closer and closer to home in my head, and I suddenly realized they were talking about my client. She lived in that township on that street, and they finally gave out her name. It was my client. She had been murdered by her son, not the mentally challenged one of the others. She was murdered without putting together the new will that had extended care for her child and had support for her church. Yeah. What I want to say to you, and I'm not trying to play on emotions, I just want to say, if you're thinking about doing new documents, to borrow a line from Nancy Reagan, just do it, okay? You can always change it later. Don't let the minutia stop you from the big picture for providing for your family, providing for your kids, providing for the church. Don't let the little things distract you from what's going on. In fact, most of us will have multiple wills before we die. Multiple. Why is that? Because our children grow up, our economic environment changes, the tax laws changes, there's a whole lot of stuff that changes. So you need to change your documents as well. Did you know that the average estate plan is what we call intestacy? Do you know what intestacy is? Al tells me I have to stop speaking legal. So, intestacy means somebody has died without putting a will in place. They have no planned documents. 60% of America has no document. Okay, so after this morning, this group isn't going to be in that 60%, right? Right. Okay. As good stewards, we're going to take care of the things God's trusted into our care. And lest you think we are only addressing this morning the more mature members of the congregation, we're also concerned with the families that have children. You also need to make plans for the care of your assets. Now, I used to have families come in, young families come into the office and say, well, I'm here because my mom said I had to be here. But I really don't have any assets. I have student loans, I have a mortgage, I have a car payment. It's like, do you have children? Well, yeah, but I have more debts than I have money. May I suggest to the young family members out there that you have some of the most precious assets you will ever own? Your children. Please, please make provision for your children. Let me tell you a story about another single mother who came into my office. She also had 3 children. All 3 had different fathers. None of the fathers were in the picture. All 3 of them had mental challenges. She had an extremely close friend who lived with her and cared for her kids as she went to work. She worked for the New York City Transit Authority. My client was extremely clear of mind, but very, very sick in body and didn't have very long to live. So we had some really in-depth discussions about planning for her family. She had a home. She had 3 insurance policies. She wanted to leave everything to her friend because she knew her well. She had taken care of the children. She trusted her with everything. And she was trusting her to raise and care for her children after she died. She had made her friend the beneficiary of all 3 life insurance policies and her pension. The house had no equity, so we talked about what would happen when she died. Do you know that when you leave something to someone, that there is no, let me do it the other way, that there may be a moral obligation to take that money and use it as the person has suggested to you, but there is no legal obligation? So that if someone leaves me money to care for your children, what can I do with that money? Anything I want. That's right. There is no legal responsibility when it's set up that way. So after we talked for a while, she decided she was going to change the beneficiaries on her life insurance policies. Well, after she died, we found out that she managed to change the beneficiary on one of the policies, and that left $25,000 to raise 3 kids. The other one, which was a larger, much larger life insurance policy, went to her friend. And the third one was never enforced because she never had paid the premiums. So now I have $25,000 to care for the house and the kids. But wait a minute, she worked for the New York Transit Authority. She had a pension. Back in the early 90s, it was over $300,000 in 90s dollars. You want to guess where that money went? To her friend. You want to guess what her friend did with the money?
Oh, no.
She took the money and ran. Left me with 3 mentally challenged kids. The house went back to the bank. The kids went into foster care. And the friend took all of the money. And later on, we discovered she had been and still was a cocaine addict. So you know where that money went. So when we're saying to you today, please be good stewards with the funds God's given you, choose very carefully who manages and cares for your assets, but also choose carefully who will raise your children. So if you're looking for some guidance on how to approach these issues, there's a wealth of counsel in Volume 4 of the Testimonies. There's a chapter called Wills and Legacies. There's also information to be found in Volume 3 of the Testimonies entitled Wealthy Parents. Now, Al's already mentioned to you that some of you may think that we're already meddling, and maybe you still feel that way. But let me share with you Volume 4 of Testimonies, page 479. It says, many manifest a needless delicacy on this point. They feel that they are stepping on forbidden ground when they introduce the subject of property to the aged, to an invalid, in order to learn what disposition they want to make of it. But this duty is as sacred as the duty to preach the word to save souls. Okay? Where she says they're doing God's business just as sure as if they were preaching the word to you. A quick look at the parable found in Luke 12:16, and let me just paraphrase it because of time that's flying by here. It talks about a rich man whose barns were so full he didn't have room to store it, so he's going to tear his barns down and build bigger ones to store it, and then sit back and take his leisure, eat, drink, and be merry, be happy, not worry about anybody else, but he's got plenty. The verse I wanted to key in on is verse 20. It says, but God said to him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? So the question is, whose shall those things be that God has provided? When you die, how much are you going to leave behind? All of it? All of it. So the question today is not how much will you leave behind, because you are going to leave all of it behind. The question really is, what will happen to what you leave behind? Will it have a lasting influence for good, or will it be a negative influence? Well, there are 3 places basically that you can leave your assets when you die. Have you provided for your family, your minor children? Our resources and our choice of caregivers can have a lasting influence on our family for good, or maybe not so good, as we've heard from my story. Al has already shared the quote from 3T121, so I won't bother to read that to you, but there's some really good advice there. Second place you can leave assets is how can you benefit others through giving to either your local church, your local academy, church school, a ministry that you love. Let me share one more story with you real quick. It's about Osceola McCarty. She was not a client of mine. She was born in 1908 and she lived in Mississippi with her grandmother and her aunt. And one day, when Osceola was about 8, her grandmother went into the hospital. When she came back out, she was unable to walk. So Osceola had to quit school to help with her grandmother and to help with the household. She never went back to school. She never married. She scrubbed laundry by hand. Now some of us may be old enough to remember what a scrubbing board was. Maybe others of us saw it on the History Channel because it's been a while. But you know, the scrub board, the washboard, right? That's how she washed the clothes. And probably in the 1960s, someone suggested to her that she ought to try some modern conveniences like a washing machine and a dryer. But she said, didn't like them because the dryer turned everything to yellow and the washing machine didn't rinse stuff enough. So she went back to doing it the old way. She would do a boiling wash in boiling water and 4 fresh water rinses. Early every morning, she went out to the backyard, started a fire under her wash pot, washed all day long, load after load after load after load, and she hung it on a 100-foot wash line. And when it was dry, she started to iron it all. She ironed till 11 o'clock at night. She started saving money from the time she started washing clothes. She put a couple pennies here, a couple pennies there from each load. She stashed them in her doll carriage, and when the carriage couldn't hold anything anymore, she went down to the bank. Remember, she dropped out of school when she was 8, so she needed help opening the bank account. And she only made deposits, no withdrawals. She said, my secret to that was, my secret is contentment. I was happy with what I had. I didn't need anything. When she retired at 87, she had over $280,000 in her account. She provided for scholarships for worthy but needy children at the University of Southern Mississippi with that money. She says she started every morning on her knees saying the Lord's Prayer. And her quote was, the more you serve the Lord, the more able you are to serve him. She said, I'm proud that I'm leaving something positive in this world. My only regret is that I didn't have more to give. What a tremendous gift she made. An absolutely amazing gift that changed the lives of many young people. Just imagine what could happen here in Pennsylvania with gifts like that. Think what would happen to our schools and academies. Think about the change a gift would bring about in our young people to have the opportunity to be educated in Seventh-day Adventist education, to absorb the values of our faith. Think about how many young people would then branch out into the mission field around the world, and yes, even in Pennsylvania, because we need missionary work done here as well to spread the good news of the gospel. What a difference it would make in so many lives. And there is a third place your resources can go. If you don't make the right preparation, your assets can go to enrich the U.S. Treasury. And I submit to you, you will not get, nor will your family get, a thank you note. So think about it, pray about it. If you have a choice, and you do, of where to leave your resources, whether it's to your family, your church, the ministries you love, or the U.S. government, I don't think it's a tough choice, right?